If you lived in America a century or two ago, you might think life was simpler, freer, and maybe even a little less regulated than today. But the truth is stranger, and often much darker. Across America's history, ordinary people have had to live under bizarre, oppressive, and sometimes downright insane laws that dictated what you could wear, what you could eat, who you could marry, even what you could say out loud. Many of these laws sound laughable today, but at the time, they were deadly serious. Break the wrong one, and you could be fined, whipped, or even jailed. Imagine living in a world where your clothing color could get you punished, where speaking badly of a politician was treated as a crime, or where your choice of hairstyle made you a target for fines. This wasn't fiction. This was America, not that long ago. And the strangest part? Many of these laws weren't accidents. They were deliberately crafted to maintain control, enforce morality, or preserve power structures that benefited the few at the expense of the many. Let's go back in time to colonial America. The Puritans who settled in New England believed that strict order was the only way to keep their society alive. To them, freedom meant discipline, and discipline meant rules, lots of rules. You weren't free to express yourself. You were free only to follow God's path as defined by the community. And so the first insane laws began. In Massachusetts, you couldn't wear lace, silk, or expensive clothing unless you had the wealth and social status to justify it. These so-called sumptuary laws were designed to keep people in their place, literally preventing poor colonists from looking too much like the rich. If a farmer's wife was caught in a silk gown, she could be hauled into court, shamed, and fined for daring to dress above her station. Fashion wasn't a matter of taste, it was a matter of legality. And it didn't stop at clothing. In 1651, Connecticut passed a law making it illegal to run or even walk quickly to church on Sundays. The Puritans wanted to enforce the idea that the Sabbath was a day of solemn rest, and moving too fast suggested a lack of reverence. Imagine being fined for simply jogging down the street to avoid being late to the sermon. These same colonies also outlawed Christmas. Yes, Christmas, the holiday now associated with joy, family, and endless consumerism, was once illegal in Puritan New England. Why? Because they saw it as a pagan celebration, a frivolous excuse for drinking and mischief. In Boston, anyone caught celebrating Christmas could be fined 5 shillings. The list of forbidden pleasures only grew stranger. Dancing, dice games, even playing the violin could be criminalized depending on where you lived. The Puritans believed joy was dangerous because it distracted from God, and so entire laws were written to crush it. By today's standards, it sounds insane, but at the time, it was deadly serious. As America grew, so did its collection of bizarre restrictions. In the 18th century, one of the most infamous laws came from the federal government itself, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Under these laws, it was illegal to publish anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the U.S. government or its officials. In other words, criticizing the president could land you in prison. Ordinary Americans, including newspaper editors, were dragged into court and jailed simply for speaking out. Freedom of speech was promised in the Constitution, but in practice, the government could silence you with the stroke of a pen. And while freedom of speech was under attack, so was freedom of love. Throughout the 19th century, states across America enforced strict marriage laws that today sound shocking. Interracial marriage was outlawed in many states, with violators facing heavy penalties or even prison. In Virginia, the infamous Racial Integrity Act of 1924 made it illegal for a white person to marry anyone with even a single drop of African or Native American ancestry. It wasn't just insane, it was cruel, designed to preserve a system of racial hierarchy. Couples who defied the law were hunted down, annulled, and ostracized by their communities. Marriage wasn't the only place where lawmakers interfered with private lives. In the 1800s, several states passed laws banning certain hairstyles and fashions. In Texas, for example, a law prohibited men from wearing long hair tied in a ponytail, claiming it was unmanly. In other regions, women were fined or ridiculed if they wore trousers instead of dresses, with cross-dressing laws written to punish anyone who stepped outside the strict gender norms of the day. Even food wasn't safe from insane legislation. In 1943, during World War II, a town in Wisconsin made it illegal to serve margarine instead of butter in restaurants. The dairy industry had such a grip on lawmakers that anti-margarine laws spread across the Midwest, some of them lasting decades. In fact, in parts of Wisconsin, margarine remained restricted until the 1960s. Imagine being treated like a criminal simply for spreading the wrong kind of fat on your toast. Some of the strangest laws targeted simple everyday behavior. In the early 1900s, New York City made it illegal for women to smoke in public. The so-called cabaret law also required special licenses for dancing in public venues, meaning that for decades, it was technically against the law to dance in most bars or clubs in the city. These laws were less about protecting people and more about controlling them, enforcing moral codes, and keeping certain groups marginalized. But perhaps the most disturbing part of these insane laws was how harshly they were enforced. Breaking these rules wasn't just a slap on the wrist. You could be fined sums that bankrupted families, thrown in jail for weeks or months, or publicly shamed in front of your neighbors. In colonial times, punishments included time in the stocks, flogging, or even banishment from the community. Imagine being cast out into the wilderness because you wore the wrong hat or played the wrong song on a Sunday. As insane as these laws were, they reveal something important. Fear and control were always at the heart of the legal system. Politicians, religious leaders, and elites used these rules to keep ordinary people in line, ensuring that no one stepped too far outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And while it's easy to laugh at the idea of margarine bans or ponytail restrictions, many of these laws carried real consequences. They destroyed lives, reinforced social hierarchies, and reminded everyone that freedom was always conditional. But here is the most unsettling truth. America's obsession with insane laws didn't stop in the past. Many of these bizarre restrictions lingered well into the 20th century, and echoes of them still exist today in local ordinances across the country. In fact, you'd probably be shocked to learn just how many insane laws are still technically on the books right now. Before we dive deeper into that world of modern absurdity, let me ask you something. If you've been fascinated or horrified by what you've heard so far, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button, drop a comment about the strangest law you've ever heard of, and share this video so more people can uncover the forgotten truths of America's past. Because trust me, what's coming next is even more unbelievable. By the time the 19th century rolled into full swing, America was a young nation still finding its identity. The revolution had promised liberty, but liberty always came with strings attached, and those strings were often woven into law. With the rise of cities, factories, and mass immigration, lawmakers began inventing new ways to regulate people's lives, sometimes to maintain order, but often to enforce conformity. The result? A legal landscape riddled with strange, oppressive, and sometimes outright comical rules that reveal the anxieties of a rapidly changing society. One of the most glaring examples was the way morality itself became a matter of law. As the Industrial Revolution transformed America's cities, waves of reformers, sometimes well-meaning, sometimes power-hungry, pushed for strict codes of conduct. Laws were written to police drinking, gambling, sex, and even leisure, creating a society where almost any act of joy could be criminalized if it didn't fit someone's idea of virtue. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the era of temperance. Alcohol had been part of American life since the first colonists arrived. But by the mid-1800s, reformers declared it the root of all social evils. Their crusade eventually birthed some of the most insane laws the country had ever seen. In Maine, for instance, lawmakers passed the Maine Law in 1851, one of the earliest statewide prohibitions on alcohol. It banned not just the sale, but even the manufacture of liquor. The result? A black market explosion, riots in the streets, and police officers themselves often caught sneaking drinks behind closed doors. These early experiments in prohibition foreshadowed the nationwide debacle that would come decades later. When the 18th Amendment ushered in prohibition in 1920, the government effectively outlawed a pastime enjoyed by millions. Ordinary citizens suddenly became criminals for enjoying a beer after work, while gangsters like Al Capone built empires on the very law meant to control society. What began as a moral crusade quickly became one of the biggest examples of legal insanity in American history. And yet, for over a decade, the law persisted, with police raiding homes, smashing barrels, and carting people off to jail for the crime of having a drink. But alcohol wasn't the only target of bizarre legal restrictions. Sexuality and gender were constant battlegrounds. Across the country, so-called morality laws criminalized behavior that lawmakers considered deviant. In the late 19th century, Anthony Comstock, a zealous postal inspector, pushed through a series of laws that made it illegal to send anything obscene through the comb. Mail including not just pornography, but even medical texts on contraception and reproductive health. Doctors could be prosecuted for providing information to their patients. Women could be jailed for ordering pamphlets about birth control. The Comstock laws were a direct assault on knowledge itself, treating education as obscenity, and they lingered on the books well into the 20th century. At the same time, local governments across America wrote absurd restrictions that reflected their own parochial fears. In some towns, it was illegal to whistle on Sundays. In others, laws prohibited women from wearing certain kinds of hats in theaters, lest they block someone's view. One city in Illinois banned ice cream from being sold on Sundays altogether, labeling it a sinful indulgence unfit for the Sabbath. These laws may sound like punchlines today, but they were real ordinances that could, and did, result in fines or arrests. And then there were the laws written to control immigrants. As millions of new arrivals from Europe, Asia, and Latin America poured into America's cities, lawmakers responded not with welcome, but with restriction. In San Francisco during the late 1800s, Chinese immigrants were targeted with humiliating and discriminatory rules, such as the infamous Q Ordinance that required prisoners to cut off their traditional braids. This wasn't about crime prevention. It was about cultural domination, an attempt to strip people of their identity by force of law. Even hairstyles could make you a criminal. Across the 19th and early 20th centuries, various states and cities passed cross-dressing laws that prohibited people from wearing clothing that didn't align with their assigned gender. In New York City, police regularly arrested women who wore trousers and men who dressed in feminine clothing. These laws weren't repealed in some places until the 1970s. For nearly a century, something as simple as putting on the wrong outfit could get you dragged off to jail. And it wasn't just what you wore, it was where you went. In the 1880s, some American towns introduced laws banning women from entering saloons, even if they weren't drinking. The presence of women in certain public spaces was considered immoral, and so laws kept them away, relegating them to the domestic sphere. What was enforced as morality was, in truth, nothing more than legal inequality. As the 20th century approached, technology itself became a target of strange restrictions. When automobiles first appeared, some towns required drivers to stop their cars, fire a rocket into the air, and wait 10 minutes before proceeding, just in case horses nearby needed time to calm down. In other places, cars were banned outright from city streets on Sundays. Early laws regulating electricity and telephones could be equally bizarre, with some communities insisting that lights be extinguished by a certain hour, or that phones could not be used for non-essential chatter. These rules reflected not just caution, but fear of the new, fear that innovation would disrupt the moral order. And yet, the deeper one digs, the more it becomes clear that these insane laws weren't random. They were symptoms of a society constantly wrestling with change. Each wave of immigration, each new invention, each cultural shift threatened the balance of power. And so lawmakers did what they always do when they feel threatened. They wrote new rules, often absurd, sometimes cruel, but always revealing. One of the most infamous examples of this dynamic was the explosion of Jim Crow laws in the post-Civil War South. These weren't quirky or comical, they were brutal. Laws mandated separate schools, separate train cars, even separate water fountains for black and white citizens. The so-called one-drop rule declared that anyone with any trace of African ancestry was subject to segregation, a legal codification of racism that devastated generations. Though not insane in the comical sense, they were insane in their cruelty, enforcing a social hierarchy with the full weight of law. By the early 20th century, America was a patchwork of strange and oppressive legal codes. In some states, it was illegal to hunt on Sundays, even if your family was starving. In others, playing baseball or even flying a kite on the Sabbath was banned. Farmers were sometimes forbidden from selling certain produce without a special license, and fishermen faced laws restricting the very nets they used, regardless of whether those laws made ecological sense. In one famous case, a town in Kansas banned the catching of fish with your bare hands, apparently a popular pastime that lawmakers decided was just too unruly to permit. These oddities might make us chuckle now, but at the time, they represented real power. A police officer could choose to enforce them selectively, punishing one person while ignoring another. Laws became tools of control, wielded unevenly and often unjustly. The bizarre ordinances about whistling, dancing, or eating ice cream were often enforced against the poor, the marginalized, or anyone the authorities wanted to put in their place. And while some laws faded quietly into obscurity, others left legacies that lasted decades. The fear-driven logic behind them, the desire to control, to punish, to enforce conformity, never really went away. It simply changed shape, resurfacing in new forms as society evolved. By the 1920s and 1930s, as America grappled with prohibition, organized crime, and the Great Depression, lawmakers unleashed yet another wave of restrictive measures that would shape the daily lives of millions. What came next was not only insane in design, but catastrophic in impact, transforming the way Americans lived and paving the way for new struggles between freedom and control. By the dawn of the 20th century, America was caught in a tug-of-war between progress and paranoia. Industrial cities boomed, automobiles roared down streets, jazz poured out of clubs, and women began demanding rights that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Yet for every step forward, lawmakers seemed determined to drag the country backward with new rules that often bordered on the absurd. The legacy of strange and oppressive laws didn't fade. It expanded, reshaped by modern anxieties and technological change. Prohibition was the crown jewel of this insanity. From 1920 to 1933, the government attempted to legislate sobriety, making it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol. In theory, it was meant to cure social ills and drunkenness, reduce crime, strengthen families. In practice, it did the opposite. Citizens who had never broken a law in their lives suddenly became criminals for brewing beer in their basements. Restaurants and clubs closed or went underground, while speakeasies flourished in every city. Organized crime syndicates grew into empires, supplying booze to a thirsty nation. Police were overwhelmed, courts clogged, and jails filled with ordinary people guilty of nothing more than enjoying a drink. What made prohibition particularly insane wasn't just the law itself, but the lengths to which the government went to enforce it. Federal agents ordered industrial alcohol to be poisoned so that bootleggers couldn't sell it for consumption. But people drank it anyway. Thousands were blinded, sickened, or killed because their own government deliberately tainted alcohol supplies. A law intended to protect the public became a death sentence for the very citizens it claimed to serve. But alcohol was only one battlefield. Across America, lawmakers targeted other aspects of daily life with bizarre restrictions. In some cities, jazz clubs were regulated with curfews and strict codes that limited how long dancing could continue. In New York, officials once banned dancing altogether without a cabaret license, meaning that tapping your feet in a cafe could technically make you a criminal. In parts of the South, it was illegal for black and white musicians to perform together on stage, a direct attempt to police not just music, but racial mixing. And the obsession with controlling morality didn't stop there. In the early 1900s, some states passed laws banning the teaching of evolution in schools, culminating in the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Teachers risked fines or dismissal for even mentioning Darwin's theory, while fundamentalist lawmakers tried to legislate science itself. The idea that knowledge could be outlawed was a stark reminder of just how fragile freedom could be when lawmakers wielded fear as a weapon. Other laws from the same period sound like jokes today, but were deadly serious at the time. In Massachusetts, it was illegal to go to bed without first taking a bath on Saturday night, a law rooted in old Puritan ideas about cleanliness and church attendance. In Kansas, it was once against the law to serve ice cream on cherry pie, an oddly specific regulation whose origins remain unclear, but whose enforcement could result in fines. In Tennessee, it was illegal to share your Netflix password decades before Netflix even existed, thanks to overly broad laws targeting unauthorized sharing of subscription services. Strange as it sounds, some of these laws remain technically enforceable even today. And while these quirks might make us laugh, many laws were far darker in intent. In the 20th century, eugenics became a legal obsession. States across America passed laws permitting the forced sterilization of people deemed unfit to reproduce. The mentally ill, the disabled, and even the poor were targeted, often without their knowledge or consent. These programs, justified as science, were in fact state-sponsored violence, stripping thousands of their most basic human rights. A Supreme Court upheld these practices in the infamous 1927 case, Buck v. Bell, in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes coldly declared, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That ruling was never formally overturned, a chilling reminder of how the law can enshrine cruelty. At the same time, racial segregation laws tightened their grip. Jim Crow didn't just enforce separate schools and buses. It seeped into nearly every aspect of daily life. Laws dictated which restaurants people could enter, which neighborhoods they could live in, and even which textbooks they could use. In Louisiana, black and white circus performers were prohibited from appearing in the same tent. In Florida, it was illegal for black and white people to play pool together. These weren't just strange laws. They were tools of systemic oppression designed to crush any possibility of equality. Even during times of national crisis, lawmakers seemed incapable of restraint. During World War II, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were subjected to exclusion laws that forced them into internment camps, their property confiscated, their freedom stripped. No charges, no trials, just laws that declared an entire ethnic group a threat. The insane logic of collective punishment became official policy, and tens of thousands of innocent people paid the price. But even as the 20th century marched toward modernity, lawmakers continued passing ordinances that seem laughable in hindsight. In Connecticut, it was once illegal to buy a pickle unless it could bounce a law designed to prevent fraud by unscrupulous sellers, but absurd in execution. In Alaska, It was illegal to push a live moose out of an airplane. In Arizona, donkeys were forbidden from sleeping in bathtubs after one animal supposedly caused a flood-related disaster. Each of these bizarre laws had some origin in real events, but instead of solving problems with common sense, lawmakers reached for the statute book. The truth is that America has always been governed by a strange mix of logic and lunacy, with laws reflecting not just reason but fear, prejudice, and superstition. And many of these laws never fully disappeared. Even today, old statutes linger in dusty law books, technically enforceable, but forgotten until some official decides to use them. In Michigan, a woman was once arrested for swearing in public, thanks to a law from the 19th century that had never been repealed. In North Carolina, bingo games are still limited by law to no more than 5 hours. In Texas, it's still technically illegal to milk another person's cow without permission. These lingering relics serve as reminders that the law is not always rational, and that once written, even the most ridiculous rules can endure for centuries. They also reveal a deeper truth, that laws, however absurd, are powerful tools. They reflect who held power at the time and what they feared most. Sometimes it was alcohol. Sometimes it was immigrants. Sometimes it was science or music, or even the simple joy of dancing. Whatever the target, the result was the same: freedom restricted, lives disrupted, and society shaped by rules that often had little connection to justice. Looking back across this history, one thing becomes clear. The story of insane American laws is really the story of control. Control over bodies, control over knowledge, control over behavior. Whether it was banning alcohol, sterilizing the vulnerable, or forbidding interracial games of pool, these laws reveal a society constantly afraid of losing its grip. And yet, the more lawmakers tried to impose order through absurd restrictions, the more chaos they often created. Even now, in the 21st century, echoes of this legal insanity remain. Modern debates over surveillance, free speech, and personal autonomy show that the impulse to legislate morality and control behavior hasn't gone away. It has only evolved. The insane laws of the past may make us laugh, but they also warn us. Because behind every bizarre statute was a moment of fear, a moment of prejudice, a moment when lawmakers chose control over freedom. And if history teaches us anything, it's that those moments have a way of repeating themselves. So when we ask how Americans once lived under such bizarre and oppressive rules, the answer is unsettling. They didn't once live that way. They still do, in different forms. The insane laws may have changed, but the struggle between freedom and control remains as alive today as it was in the days when eating ice cream on Sunday could land you in trouble.